This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The summer of 1867 settled over the hills of Westchester County like a damp shroud. The war had ended 2 years prior, but its echoes still reverberated through communities trying to rebuild what Sherman's march and Lincoln's death had torn apart. It was in this atmosphere of national healing that Cornelius Caldwell made his decision to construct what would become one of the most peculiar estates in the Hudson Valley. Caldwell was not a man given to flights of fancy. Born in 1801 to a family of modest means in Albany, he had built his fortune through methodical investments in railway construction and shipping routes along the Great Lakes. By 1865, at the age of 64, he controlled a network of commercial interests that stretched from Buffalo to Boston. Those who knew him described a man of rigid habits and mathematical precision in all matters of business. Records from the Westchester County Clerk's office show that Caldwell purchased a tract of 420 acres in September of 1866, paying the considerable sum of $8,000 to the estate of one Jeremiah Winthrop, whose family had farmed the land since colonial times. The property sat atop a modest rise known locally as Beacon Hill, overlooking the Croton River Valley. What drew Caldwell to this particular parcel remains unclear from existing documentation, though a letter discovered in 1953 among papers donated to the Westchester Historical Society provides some insight. Written to his business partner Alvin Hartwell and dated October 12, 1866, Caldwell describes his first visit to the property. "The land speaks to me in ways I cannot adequately express through commercial correspondence. There is something in the soil itself that calls for permanence, for a structure that will endure beyond the temporary concerns of our current age. I have walked every acre and found what appears to be the foundation stones of some earlier dwelling, though county records show no previous construction. The local farmer, one Isaiah Morton, claims his grandfather spoke of lights seen on this hill during the colonial period, though he offers no specifics." Construction began in the spring of 1867. Caldwell hired Mordecai Blackthorne, an architect recently arrived from England who had gained attention for his work on several Gothic Revival churches in Manhattan. Blackthorne's design for what would become known as Caldwell Manor departed significantly from the prevailing architectural fashions of the period. Where most wealthy Americans were embracing Second Empire or Italianate styles, Blackthorne created something far more austere and imposing. The manor rose from the hilltop like a medieval fortress transplanted to the American landscape. Constructed primarily of local fieldstone with limestone trim quarried from upstate quarries, the building measured 140 feet in length and 60 feet in depth. 3 stories above ground contained 42 rooms, including a great hall with a vaulted ceiling that rose 28 feet from the marble floor. More unusual was the extensive underground level that Caldwell insisted be carved directly into the bedrock beneath the foundation. Contemporary accounts of the construction phase hint at difficulties that were never fully documented in official records. A brief mention in the September 15, 1867 issue of the Tarrytown Argus notes that work had been suspended for 3 weeks following an incident involving the excavation crew. No details are provided, but subsequent issues of the paper contain advertisements seeking experienced men for stonework, discretion required, previous experience with unusual circumstances preferred. By November of 1867, the exterior was largely complete, though work continued on interior finishing for several more months. Caldwell moved into residence that winter, along with his household staff, Miriam Hensley, his housekeeper of 15 years, Davidson Price, his personal secretary and accountant, and Uriah Crowley, a man of uncertain background who served as groundskeeper and general maintenance supervisor. The establishment of the household marked the beginning of a period that later residents of the area would remember with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Caldwell, who had maintained an active social calendar during his years in Albany, became increasingly reclusive after taking up residence at the Manor. Invitations to local social functions went unanswered. Business associates who called at the estate reported being received in the Great Hall, but never invited deeper into the house. Methodist minister Reverend Samuel Ashworth, who had known Caldwell since their Albany days, made several attempts to maintain their friendship. In a letter to his sister dated March 3, 1868, Reverend Ashworth wrote, "Cornelius receives me cordially enough, but there is a change in him that I cannot quite define. He speaks constantly of his work, though when pressed for details becomes evasive. He mentions experiments and research, subjects that never held his interest in previous years. Most peculiar is his insistence that certain rooms in the house must remain undisturbed. When I inquired about the nature of this work, he simply smiled and said that science would soon prove many things that conventional wisdom considered impossible." The nature of Caldwell's mysterious activities became a source of speculation throughout the county. Deliveries to the Manor increased dramatically during the winter and spring of 1868. Local merchants reported unusual orders for chemical apparatus, optical equipment, and quantities of copper wire that seemed excessive for a private residence. More curious still were shipments that arrived by special train from New York City, transported by armed guards who remained on the property until the cargo was unloaded into the underground sections of the house. Dr. Ephraim Sterling, who served as the local physician, was called to the Manor twice during this period. His medical journal, donated to Columbia College in 1912, contains entries that provide our best glimpse into conditions at the estate during this time. The first visit, on February 14, 1868, was to treat Davidson Price for what was described as nervous exhaustion. Dr. Sterling noted that the secretary appeared haggard and sleepless, speaking in fragmentary sentences about sounds that keep him awake at night. Price confided that these sounds, which he described as a low humming, punctuated by occasional sharp reports, came from beneath the house, but ceased whenever anyone approached the lower levels. Dr. Sterling's second visit occurred on May 7, 1868, when he was summoned to examine Uriah Crowley, who had reportedly collapsed while working in the Manor's basement. The physician's notes describe finding Crowley in a state of extreme agitation, claiming to have seen movements in the walls themselves, and insisting that the basement contained machines that breathe. Caldwell dismissed these claims as the ravings of an overworked mind, but Dr. Sterling noted that the groundskeeper's pupils remained dilated for several hours after the incident, despite showing no other signs of intoxication or injury. As summer approached, reports began to reach the outside world of strange phenomena associated with the Manor. Farmers working fields within sight of Beacon Hill reported that their animals became restless whenever the wind carried sounds from the estate. Electromagnetic disturbances were noted by the telegraph operator in Tarrytown, who complained that messages routed through the local lines suffered interference during certain hours, particularly late at night, when peculiar lights were visible in the Manor's windows. The July 23, 1868 issue of the New York Tribune contains a brief item, dateline from Tarrytown, that reads, "Residents of this scenic river community report unusual atmospheric effects emanating from the hilltop estate of railroad magnate Cornelius Caldwell. Local farmers claim that livestock refuse to graze in fields adjacent to the property, and several citizens have reported disruption to compass readings when traveling near Beacon Hill." Mr. Caldwell could not be reached for comment, though his secretary issued a statement attributing these claims to the natural nervousness of rural folk when confronted with the progress of modern science. "Hey, This dismissive response proved to be Davidson Price's final public statement. On August 2, 1868, the secretary departed the manor suddenly, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note addressed to Caldwell. "I can no longer remain in service to work whose nature I do not understand, and whose purposes I have come to fear. The sounds from below have grown constant, and I have seen things moving behind the walls that no man should see. I recommend that you abandon whatever course you have set upon before it leads to consequences beyond your control." Price's departure left only 3 permanent residents at the manor: Caldwell himself, housekeeper Miriam Hensley, and the increasingly unstable Uriah Crowley. Neighbors noted that deliveries to the estate became more frequent and more secretive during this period. Wagons arrived under cover of darkness, their cargo concealed beneath heavy tarpaulins. The men who handled these shipments wore no uniforms and spoke little to local residents who encountered them on the roads. September brought the first direct account of the activities within Caldwell Manor, though this testimony would not surface until many years later. Miriam Hensley, who had served the household faithfully for over a decade, reached what she apparently considered her breaking point. On the night of September 15, 1868, she departed the estate on foot, walking the 12 miles to Tarrytown, where she sought shelter at the Methodist parsonage. Reverend Ashworth's private papers, unsealed by his family in 1920, contain a detailed account of Hensley's condition when she arrived at his door. She appeared, according to the minister, to have aged years in the few months since he had last seen her. Her hair had turned completely gray, and she spoke in whispered fragments about the Master's work and things that should not be. Over the following days, as her composure gradually returned, Hensley provided Reverend Ashworth with details that he found so disturbing that he considered alerting civil authorities. According to her account, Caldwell had transformed the underground levels of the manor into something resembling a laboratory, though unlike any scientific facility she could adequately describe. The basement contained apparatus that seemed to combine mechanical and electrical elements in configurations that defied conventional understanding. Most troubling was her description of Caldwell's experiments with what she termed the principles of life itself, where she claimed to have observed him working with specimens that she could not clearly identify, conducting procedures that involved the application of electrical current to organic matter. The results of these experiments, according to Hensley, were kept in sealed chambers that she was forbidden to enter, though she reported hearing sounds from within these rooms that suggested the presence of something alive. Reverend Ashworth faced a dilemma that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Hensley's account was fantastic enough to invite dismissal as the ravings of an overwrought mind. Yet her evident sincerity and the physical toll of her experiences lent credibility to her claims. Moreover, the minister's own observations of changes in Caldwell's behavior provided corroborating evidence that something extraordinary was occurring at the manor. After much prayer and consideration, Reverend Ashworth chose a middle course. Rather than approaching the authorities with allegations he could not prove, he decided to attempt a direct appeal to his old friend. On October 1, 1868, he rode to Caldwell Manor with the intention of offering spiritual counsel and determining for himself the nature of the activities that had so disturbed his housekeeper. The visit would be his last. Caldwell received the minister in the great hall, as had become his custom with all visitors. Reverend Ashworth's notes from this encounter, written immediately upon his return home that evening, provide our final first-hand account of conditions within the manor. He found Caldwell much changed from their previous meeting. The businessman appeared to have lost considerable weight, and his complexion had taken on an unhealthy pallor. More disturbing were his eyes, which the minister described as burning with an intensity that spoke of profound obsession rather than natural enthusiasm. When pressed about the concerns raised by his former housekeeper, Caldwell became animated in his defense of what he termed the greatest scientific advancement in human history. He spoke of having unlocked principles of existence that had eluded researchers for centuries, of having achieved mastery over the boundary between life and death itself. He claimed to have proven that consciousness could be sustained beyond the physical deterioration of the body, and that death was merely a transition that could be reversed through the proper application of electrical and chemical forces. Reverend Ashworth attempted to engage his friend in theological discussion about the implications of such work, suggesting that certain mysteries were perhaps beyond the intended scope of human knowledge. Caldwell's response was swift and vehement. He denounced what he called the superstitious limitations of religious thinking, and insisted that science would soon render such beliefs obsolete. Death, he claimed, was simply another problem to be solved through methodical investigation and experimentation. As their conversation continued, Caldwell began to hint at specific achievements that Reverend Ashworth found increasingly difficult to accept as the products of rational inquiry. The businessman spoke of having succeeded in reanimating specimens that had been dead for considerable periods, and of having established communication with entities that existed in what he described as the liminal spaces between life and death. Most troubling was his suggestion that these entities had provided him with knowledge and capabilities that far exceeded normal human understanding. The conversation was interrupted by sounds from the lower levels of the house. Reverend Ashworth described hearing a rhythmic thumping, as if something large were striking the walls or floor with considerable force. Caldwell appeared unconcerned by these noises, explaining them as the normal operation of his electrical apparatus. However, the minister noted that the sound seemed to follow a pattern too complex and irregular to be purely mechanical in origin. When Reverend Ashworth suggested that he might be permitted to examine these scientific marvels for himself, Caldwell's demeanor changed markedly. He became evasive and defensive, insisting that his work was not yet ready for outside observation. He spoke of the need for absolute secrecy to prevent his discoveries from being stolen by competitors or suppressed by those who lacked the vision to appreciate their significance. The meeting ended on an uncomfortable note, with Caldwell escorting his visitor to the door while continuing to speak obsessively about his research. As Reverend Ashworth prepared to depart, he noted that Uriah Crowley was watching from an upstairs window, his face bearing an expression of unmistakable terror. The groundskeeper made no acknowledgment when the minister raised his hand in greeting, simply stepping back from the window, as if afraid to be seen. Reverend Ashworth's account of this visit concludes with a reflection that proves prophetic. "I fear that my old friend has ventured into territories of knowledge that no man was meant to explore. His obsession with conquering death has led him to create something that threatens to conquer him instead. I pray that he will see reason before his experiments produce consequences that extend beyond the walls of his unhappy house." No further visitors called at Caldwell Manor during the autumn of 1868. The estate became completely isolated from the surrounding community, its only contacts with the outside world coming through occasional supply deliveries and the weekly shipments of coal required to feed the furnaces that powered whatever apparatus Caldwell had constructed in his underground laboratory. Local residents reported that the strange phenomena associated with the manor intensified during this period. The electromagnetic disturbances that had previously affected only the telegraph lines now extended to pocket watches and compass readings throughout the valley. Farmers complained that their wells produced water with an unusual metallic taste, and several reported that livestock refused to drink from sources that drew from the same aquifer that supplied Beacon Hill. More disturbing were the reports of sounds that carried from the estate during the late evening hours. These were not the industrial noises that might be expected from a working laboratory, but rather a collection of sounds that defied easy categorization. Witnesses described hearing what seemed to be voices calling out in languages they could not identify, punctuated by mechanical grinding and the sharp crack of electrical discharge. Dr. Sterling, whose medical practice served the entire county, began to notice a pattern of ailments among residents whose properties bordered the Caldwell estate. Several patients complained of persistent nightmares featuring images of figures moving through underground chambers. Others reported episodes of sudden weakness or disorientation when working in fields that offered a direct view of the manor. Most puzzling were cases of temporary paralysis that seemed to coincide with the periods when strange lights were visible in the manor's windows. The first direct evidence of catastrophe at Caldwell Manor came on the morning of December 3, 1868. Uriah Crowley appeared at the door of the nearest neighbor, a dairy farmer named Josiah Morton, in a state of complete mental collapse. Morton's account, recorded in a deposition filed with the county sheriff, describes finding Crowley white as snow and shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. The groundskeeper was unable to speak coherently for several hours, producing only fragmentary words and phrases that Morton initially dismissed as delirium. As Crowley's condition stabilized, however, a terrifying picture began to emerge. According to his account, the experiments in the manor's basement had succeeded beyond Caldwell's wildest hopes, but the results had proven far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Crowley claimed that his employer had indeed managed to restore life to organic matter that had been dead for extended periods, but that these reanimated specimens retained only a mockery of their former existence. More troubling was Crowley's insistence that these creatures had begun to exhibit behaviors that suggested a form of consciousness that was hostile to normal life. He described scenes of horror from the underground chambers where Caldwell's creations had turned against their creator with a malevolence that seemed to increase with each passing day. According to the groundskeeper, several of these entities had escaped from their containment chambers and were now loose within the manor itself. Sheriff Harrison Blackwood initially dismissed Crowley's account as the product of mental instability brought on by isolation and overwork. However, the man's evident terror and the specific details of his story prompted the sheriff to organize a small investigative party to visit the manor and determine the actual state of affairs. On the morning of December 5th, Sheriff Blackwood, accompanied by Dr. Sterling and 2 deputies, rode to Beacon Hill to conduct what they assumed would be a routine inquiry into reports of disturbance. What they found at Caldwell Manor would haunt the investigators for the remainder of their lives. The estate appeared deserted from the outside. No smoke rose from any of the chimneys despite the bitter December cold. The main door stood slightly ajar, an unusual circumstance, given Caldwell's obsessive attention to security and privacy. When the party called out for admittance, their voices echoed through empty corridors without response. Sheriff Blackwood's official report, filed on December 7, 1868, provides a carefully worded account of the investigation that followed. The document describes finding the Great Hall in perfect order, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal effects remained in their customary places, and the household's valuable furnishings showed no evidence of theft or vandalism. The upper floors of the manor revealed similar conditions, with Caldwell's personal chambers appearing as if their occupant had simply stepped out for a brief errand. The investigation took on a different character when the party descended to the basement levels. Here, Sheriff Blackwood's report becomes notably vague, mentioning only that they discovered apparatus of unknown purpose and evidence of scientific experimentation. The document makes no mention of Crowley's claims about reanimated creatures, referring instead to circumstances that require further investigation by appropriate scientific authorities. Dr. Sterling's private notes, however, provide a far more detailed and disturbing account of what the investigators actually encountered in Caldwell's underground laboratory. The basement had been divided into multiple chambers, each containing electrical apparatus of considerable complexity. Copper wires ran along the walls and ceiling in intricate patterns that seemed to form some type of circuit or network. Large glass containers held specimens that Dr. Sterling initially could not identify, though closer examination revealed them to be various forms of organic matter in different stages of what appeared to be controlled decomposition. Most disturbing were the sealed chambers that Crowley had mentioned in his testimony. These rooms, constructed with reinforced steel doors and multiple locking mechanisms, contained the results of Caldwell's most advanced experiments. Dr. Sterling's notes describe opening one of these chambers and discovering what he termed organized tissue that showed evidence of recent animation, despite obvious signs of post-mortem deterioration. The physician's medical training allowed him to recognize that the specimens within these chambers had indeed been dead for considerable periods before being subjected to some form of reanimation process. However, the current state of these specimens defied easy categorization. They appeared to exist in a condition somewhere between life and death, responding to stimuli but lacking the coordinated responses that characterized normal living organisms. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery in the deepest chamber of the basement. Here, according to Dr. Sterling's notes, the investigators found evidence of Caldwell's final experiment. The chamber contained a complex apparatus that seemed designed to channel electrical current through a human subject. Leather restraints and monitoring devices suggested that this equipment had been used on a living person, though whether as subject or victim could not be determined from the physical evidence. Caldwell himself was nowhere to be found. The mystery of the businessman's disappearance would never be satisfactorily resolved. Every room in the manor was thoroughly searched, as were the grounds and outbuildings. No personal effects were missing from his chambers, and his considerable cash reserves remained untouched in the estate's safe. Most puzzling was the absence of any signs of struggle or forced entry that might suggest foul play. Sheriff Blackwood's investigation focused on the possibility that Caldwell had suffered some form of accident related to his electrical experiments. The apparatus in the basement certainly posed considerable dangers to anyone operating it without proper precautions. However, no body was ever recovered despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding areas. Dr. Sterling privately expressed a different theory to colleagues at the County Medical Society. Based on his examination of the laboratory equipment and the specimens contained therein, he suspected that Caldwell had become the subject of his own final experiment. The physician theorized that the businessman had attempted to apply his reanimation process to himself, either as the ultimate test of his theories or as a desperate attempt to achieve the immortality that had become his obsession. The evidence for this theory was circumstantial but suggestive. The electrical apparatus in the deepest chamber appeared to have been operated from within, suggesting that its subject had initiated the process voluntarily. Moreover, certain of the monitoring devices showed readings that indicated the equipment had been activated for an extended period before ceasing operation sometime during the night of December 2nd. Whether Caldwell's final experiment succeeded or failed would remain unknown. No trace of his body was found, either in its normal state or in the reanimated condition that characterized his other specimens. The businessman simply vanished, leaving behind only the mysterious apparatus and the grotesque results of his earlier investigations. The immediate aftermath of the discovery at Caldwell Manor presented local authorities with unprecedented challenges. The nature of the experiments conducted in the basement defied easy explanation or categorization. Moreover, the potential dangers posed by the reanimated specimens required immediate attention from experts in fields that barely existed in 1868. Sheriff Blackwood made the decision to seal the manor and contact scientific authorities in New York City who might be better equipped to deal with the situation. Dr. Josiah Franklin of Columbia College was summoned to examine the apparatus and specimens, while Professor Marcus Whitmore of the New York Academy of Sciences was asked to assess the potential risks to public safety. The scientists who arrived at Caldwell Manor in mid-December 1868 found themselves confronting evidence of research that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life and death. Dr. Franklin's preliminary report, filed with the state authorities on December 20th, acknowledged that Caldwell had achieved results that extend beyond current scientific understanding, while warning that the methods employed appeared to have produced organisms whose continued existence poses unpredictable dangers. Professor Whitmore was more direct in his assessment. His confidential report to the governor's office stated bluntly that the specimens contained in the manor's basement represented abominations against natural law that must be destroyed before they pose a threat to the surrounding population. He recommended that the entire underground laboratory be sealed and filled with concrete to prevent any possibility of the experiments continuing without human supervision. The decision to destroy Caldwell's research was not made lightly. Several members of the scientific community argued that the businessman's discoveries, however disturbing, represented advances in understanding that could benefit mankind if properly studied and controlled. Dr. Sterling himself wrote to the state medical board suggesting that the reanimation process might offer insights into diseases that had previously been considered incurable. These arguments were overruled by more pragmatic concerns. The reanimated specimens showed increasing signs of hostility toward normal life forms, and several had already demonstrated the ability to escape from their containment chambers. Moreover, without Caldwell's direct supervision, the electrical apparatus was beginning to malfunction in ways that threatened to spread the reanimation effect beyond its intended targets. On January 15, 1869, a team of military engineers arrived at Caldwell Manor with orders to neutralize the threat posed by the basement laboratory. Working under the direction of Professor Whitmore, they systematically dismantled the electrical apparatus and incinerated the reanimated specimens using specially designed high-temperature furnaces. The underground chambers were then filled with concrete and sealed behind steel barriers designed to prevent any possibility of future access. The mansion itself was left intact but uninhabited. Legal challenges over Caldwell's estate prevented its sale for several years, and the property developed a reputation that made it difficult to find buyers even after ownership was finally established. The few families who attempted to live in the manor during the 1870s reported disturbing phenomena that drove them away within months of taking residence. These reports followed a consistent pattern. Residents complained of sounds emanating from areas of the house that should have been silent, particularly from the direction of the sealed basement. Temperature fluctuations occurred without apparent cause, with certain rooms becoming suddenly cold despite adequate heating. Most troubling were accounts of electrical disturbances that affected not only the manor's limited wiring, but also pocket watches, compass readings, and other metal objects throughout the house. Dr. Sterling, who maintained a professional interest in the case, documented these phenomena in his medical journal. His entry for March 3, 1871, describes examining a family named Richardson who had occupied the manor for 6 weeks before departing suddenly. According to his notes, every member of the household had developed symptoms that included insomnia, loss of appetite, and episodes of disorientation. The children showed particular sensitivity to whatever forces were at work in the house, experiencing nightmares that featured imagery remarkably similar to descriptions of Caldwell's experiments despite having no knowledge of the manor's history? By 1875, Caldwell Manor had gained a reputation that effectively rendered it uninhabitable. Local residents spoke of the property in whispered conversations, sharing stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed to have seen lights moving through the windows of the abandoned house, while others reported hearing sounds that suggested the basement laboratory was somehow still in operation, despite having been sealed years earlier. Professor Whitmore, who had supervised the destruction of Caldwell's apparatus, made periodic visits to the manor to monitor conditions and ensure that the sealing measures remained effective. His reports from this period, preserved in the archives of the New York Academy of Sciences, document a gradual intensification of the phenomena associated with the property. By 1878, Whitmore was reporting electromagnetic disturbances strong enough to affect sensitive instruments brought within a quarter-mile of the manor. Compass readings became unreliable throughout the immediate area, and telegraph lines that passed near the property experienced regular interference that could not be attributed to atmospheric conditions. Most concerning was evidence that the concrete seals in the basement were beginning to show signs of stress, developing hairline cracks that seemed to follow no pattern consistent with normal settling or thermal expansion. The final chapter in the history of Caldwell Manor began in 1880, when the property was purchased by the county for conversion into a public institution. Plans called for the building to house a school for children with developmental difficulties, a use that seemed appropriate for a structure that had become unmarketable for normal residential purposes. The renovation work required for this conversion would provide the first opportunity since 1869 to examine the sealed basement chambers. Work crews who attempted to access the underground levels in preparation for the conversion made a discovery that effectively ended all plans for the building's future use. Despite the concrete ceiling and steel barriers that had been installed 11 years earlier, the basement chambers were no longer empty. Workers reported finding evidence of recent activity, including electrical apparatus that bore no resemblance to Caldwell's original equipment, but appeared to be far more advanced than anything that existed in 1880. More disturbing were signs that the reanimation experiments had somehow continued during the years when the basement was supposedly sealed. Fresh specimens were discovered in various stages of the process that Caldwell had pioneered, suggesting that someone or something had maintained the research despite the absence of any human supervision. The specimens themselves had evolved beyond the crude results of Caldwell's original experiments, showing levels of organization and apparent intelligence that posed a clear threat to anyone who might encounter them. The county authorities made the immediate decision to evacuate the work crews and abandon all plans for converting the manor. Professor Whitmore, now in his 70s but still the foremost authority on the dangers posed by the property, was called in to assess the situation and recommend a permanent solution. His final report on Caldwell Manor, dated October 12, 1880, represents one of the most disturbing documents in the archives of American science. Whitmore concluded that Caldwell's experiments had achieved a form of success that extended far beyond the businessman's original intentions. The reanimation process had not only restored life to dead tissue, but had created entities capable of continuing and improving the research on their own. According to Whitmore's analysis, these entities had spent the intervening years developing more sophisticated techniques for extending their form of existence to other organic matter. They had also demonstrated the ability to manipulate electrical and mechanical systems in ways that suggested intelligence far exceeding normal human capabilities. Most troubling was evidence that they had begun to establish contact with similar entities that existed in other locations, forming what appeared to be a network of reanimated consciousness that spanned considerable distances. Professor Whitmore's recommendations were stark and unambiguous. He advised that Caldwell Manor be completely destroyed by fire with the basement levels subsequently flooded and sealed under several feet of reinforced concrete. Moreover, he suggested that the entire property be declared permanently unsafe and removed from any possibility of future development or habitation. These recommendations were implemented during the winter of 1880-81. The mansion was systematically dismantled and burned, with particular attention paid to ensuring that no portion of the structure survived intact. The basement was flooded with a mixture of water and chemicals designed to neutralize any biological activity, then sealed under multiple layers of concrete and steel. The entire property was finally enclosed within a high fence and posted with warnings against trespassing. Official records of Caldwell Manor end with these disposal measures, but the story of the property continued in the folklore and whispered histories of Westchester County. Residents of the area reported that the electromagnetic disturbances gradually subsided following the destruction of the mansion, though sensitive instruments continued to register anomalous readings from the direction of Beacon Hill for many years afterward. Dr. Sterling, who had maintained his interest in the case throughout the 1870s, made one final entry in his medical journal regarding Caldwell Manor. Written on January 30, 1881, shortly after the destruction was completed, his notes record a conversation with Uriah Crowley, who had returned to the area following news of the mansion's demolition. Crowley, according to Dr. Sterling, appeared much aged by his experiences, but finally able to speak coherently about the events of 1868. The former groundskeeper confirmed many of the suspicions that had surrounded Caldwell's final experiments, revealing details that had been too disturbing to discuss while the manor still stood. He described the businessman's growing obsession with achieving personal immortality and his eventual decision to subject himself to the reanimation process while still alive. Most significantly, Crowley revealed that he had been present during Caldwell's final experiment. According to his account, the businessman had succeeded in his goal of preserving his consciousness beyond physical death, but the process had fundamentally changed the nature of his existence. The entity that resulted from the experiment retained Caldwell's memories and intelligence, but had been freed from the moral and ethical constraints that normally govern human behavior. Crowley claimed that this transformed version of Caldwell had been responsible for the continued experiments during the years when the basement was supposedly sealed. Using knowledge gained through his new form of existence, the entity had developed techniques for creating more sophisticated reanimated organisms and had begun working toward the goal of spreading this condition to the entire human population. Dr. Sterling's journal entry concludes with a reflection on the implications of Crowley's testimony. If even half of what this man claims is true, then we have narrowly escaped a catastrophe whose scope defies imagination. The destruction of the manor may have ended Caldwell's particular experiments, but the knowledge he gained appears to have survived in forms that we do not fully understand. I pray that the sealing measures prove sufficient to contain whatever remains of his research. But I fear that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. The property that once contained Caldwell Manor remains sealed to this day. Modern surveys of the area continue to register electromagnetic anomalies that cannot be explained by conventional science, and occasional reports surface of sounds or lights emanating from the direction of Beacon Hill during the dark hours before dawn. County authorities maintain the warning signs and periodic inspections of the sealing barriers, though the official explanation for these measures refers only to environmental contamination from 19th century industrial activity. In 1952, a graduate student at Columbia University named Patricia Henley attempted to research the Caldwell Manor case for her dissertation on unusual scientific experiments in the post-Civil War period. She was able to locate many of the original documents and interview descendants of several witnesses before her research was abruptly terminated by the university administration. Ms. Henley's notes and materials were confiscated and classified under a state security designation that remains in effect today. The only indication of her findings comes from a letter she wrote to her sister shortly before her research was shut down. In this letter, dated November 15, 1952, she wrote, "The more I learn about what happened at Caldwell Manor, the more I understand why the authorities were so determined to bury the story." Cornelius Caldwell succeeded in achieving something that challenges our fundamental understanding of life and death, but the cost of this success extends far beyond what anyone in 1868 could have imagined. I have found evidence that suggests the experiments at the manor were not unique, and that similar research may have been conducted at other locations throughout the country during the same period. Miss Henley's letter breaks off at this point, and no further trace of her research has ever been found. She completed her graduate studies with a dissertation on an entirely different topic and went on to a career in secondary education, never again showing any interest in historical research. When interviewed by curiosity seekers in later years, she claimed to have no memory of her work on the Caldwell Manor case and expressed puzzlement about why anyone would be interested in such an obscure historical footnote. The truth about what Cornelius Caldwell achieved in his underground laboratory may never be fully known. The destruction of the manor and the classification of related documents have effectively removed most evidence of the experiments from public record. However, the sealed property on Beacon Hill continues to remind local residents that some aspects of human knowledge carry dangers that extend far beyond the immediate consequences of discovery. Modern scientists who have reviewed the limited available documentation generally dismiss the Caldwell Manor case as an example of 19th century pseudoscience mixed with local folklore and sensationalism. They point out that the technology required for true reanimation of dead tissue was not available in 1868, and that accounts of the experiments probably represent misunderstandings of more conventional scientific research. Yet questions remain about certain aspects of the case that are difficult to explain through conventional interpretations. The electromagnetic disturbances associated with the property were documented by multiple independent sources and continued for decades after the supposed source was destroyed. The consistency of witness accounts, despite the fantastic nature of their claims, suggests either an elaborate hoax involving dozens of participants or exposure to phenomena that genuinely challenged understanding of natural law. Perhaps most puzzling is the fact that Cornelius Caldwell, despite his considerable wealth and social position, simply vanished without leaving any trace of his intended destination or activities. An extensive investigation by private detectives hired by his business associates found no evidence that he had made preparations for travel or had liquidated assets in preparation for relocating. His disappearance remains as complete and inexplicable today as it was in 1868. The sealed property continues to attract occasional attention from researchers and curiosity seekers, though access remains strictly prohibited by state and federal regulations. Local police report that trespassers are sometimes found unconscious near the fence line, apparently having fainted from unknown causes while attempting to approach the former site of the manor. These individuals invariably claim to have no memory of how they came to be unconscious, and medical examinations reveal no evidence of injury or intoxication. In recent years, advances in electromagnetic sensing technology have provided new evidence that something unusual continues to occur in the area once occupied by Caldwell Manor. Satellite surveys conducted by the Environmental Protection Agency have detected energy patterns beneath the sealed concrete that do not correspond to any known geological or industrial sources. These readings suggest the presence of organized electrical activity at considerable depth, following patterns that appear to be too complex and regular to result from natural processes. Government scientists who have reviewed this data officially maintain that the readings represent residual effects from the 19th century industrial activity that preceded the sealing of the site. However, unofficial comments from researchers familiar with the case suggest that the electromagnetic patterns are actually intensifying over time, rather than gradually dissipating as would be expected from inactive industrial residue. The implications of this ongoing activity remain a subject of speculation among the limited number of scientists who have access to the classified data. Some theorize that Caldwell's experiments may have created some form of self-sustaining electrical or biological process that continues to operate beneath the concrete seals. Others suggest that the businessman may have succeeded in preserving his consciousness in a form that does not require conventional biological support, and that this entity continues to pursue its research despite being physically contained. Whatever the truth may be, the Caldwell Manor case represents a unique chapter in American scientific history, whether viewed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled experimentation or as evidence of discoveries that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence. The events of 1867-1880 continue to raise questions that conventional science cannot adequately answer. The sealed property on Beacon Hill stands as a monument to the ambition and folly of one man's quest to conquer death itself. Whether Cornelius Caldwell ultimately succeeded or failed in his goal may never be known with certainty. However, the continued precautions maintained around his former estate suggest that some achievements in human knowledge carry consequences that extend far beyond the intentions of those who pursue them. As long as the seals remain intact and the warning signs stand in place, the full truth about Caldwell Manor may remain buried beneath layers of concrete and official silence. Yet the questions raised by the case continue to echo through time, reminding us that the boundaries between life and death may be far more permeable than we dare to imagine, and that some doors, once opened, may prove impossible to close again. The story serves as a reminder that, in our pursuit of knowledge and progress, we must always consider not just what we can achieve, but what we should achieve. Cornelius Caldwell's legacy stands as a warning from the past about the dangers that await those who venture too far beyond the established boundaries of human understanding, seeking answers to questions that perhaps were never meant to be asked.